All
Well, I
right.
have us on page 17 in, almost said the journey home, just because we read that for so many years. Absence from Felicity, the story of Helen Schucman and her scribing of A Course in Miracles by Kenneth Wapnick, Ph.D. And we, in the last two sessions, we read the preface and the introduction. And so we're now ready to dive into the first part of the intro to part one.
Yeah. So you want to read?
Sure. Sure. So Ken begins, the main title of the chapters of this first part, Heaven and Helen, in quotes, cute pun, was taken from a paper Helen had written in graduate school about 10 years before the scribing of A Course in Miracles began. The paper fulfilled an, quote, assignment to describe a specific problem in our lives and how he had finally resolved it, unquote. The problem Helen chose was her lifetime's preoccupation with God, and she introduced the paper as follows. This is the story of my search for God. It began when I was a very little girl and ended comparatively recently on a somewhat tentative note. And then in brackets, Ken has obviously written again years before the course. Then she continues, whether or not you think I found a solution in the end depends very largely on how you look at the problem itself. You could certainly say that from one point of view, I did not solve it at all, since on the question of God, I came to no conclusions. However, you might also say that the problem was not entirely a religious one from the very beginning, so that solution in religious terms is not really essential. Either way, I did get over the preoccupation with the whole question, and that in itself is a solution of a sort. And then Ken comments, obviously, as Helen herself later observed, that was not the real ending of the story. In her unpublished autobiography, an amalgam of several edited versions to be described presently, Helen looked back on this graduate school assignment and described the paper as having traced her early interest in religion. And then he continues with quoting from Helen, through a long series of disappointments to a sense of resignation and defeat, a long and discouraging search for God, and was obviously written from a psychological rather than a religious point of view. That was the conceptual framework at which I had arrived at the time and the level at which I fully expected to remain both professionally and personally. So, interesting start, huh? Do you need any comments on that, Lynn?
I'm talking. You're not hearing.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And I just noticed I needed to acknowledge the recording on my screen, which I was looking away from. Yeah.
So it's like she starts talking about, it's like today's lesson, which today's lesson is all about that yearning that you have, that you've had your whole life to go home. I was thinking about that song from Frozen, Into the Unknown. You hear that voice and it's calling, come home, come home. And that's what she's writing about. I heard that voice. I wanted to come home. And then the end of the story is I figured out that God is more of a concept, and I don't really, and I'm just going to see it as that. I mean, it seems like she kind of just said, I'm not going to find what I'm looking for. And maybe I was wrong to even think that there was something to look for.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a suggestion that she realized that a religious answer in the context of conventional formal religion wasn't going to, perhaps I would, as putting Ken's words in my mouth, so, but because I know Ken talks about formal religion as being antithetical to the course's metaphysics, but the true religion, I would suggest, as Richard Bach does in some of his writing, is a way of finding out what's true, and I think in the course's clarification to that would be, we are ultimately one being, which is the truth, but we've created obstacles to the awareness of truth's presence or love's presence, which I consider synonymous. And so that's the whole emphasis of the course, is not yeah, platitudes of affirmations to what's already true and correct and eternally so, but more getting rid of all the barriers and the obstacles that we've put in our mind to being aware of our true nature.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
it's interesting because we do have an experience of this, and you know, I can guarantee you that everyone here has had an experience of saying that's just an idea, that's just a thought, you know, it's an interesting concept, and then have an experience where that interesting concept or thought or idea became a reality in our mind, and we saw how it was true, and then you know those platitudes suddenly have a completely different meaning because you see that it was that they're not just words, but they actually do have a real meaning as far as much as reality can go in this world of illusion. But it's interesting that of the topics, Helen, who is an avowed or was an avowed atheist, when she was asked to make up a topic of something that she um, had a problem with and overcame in her life, the thing that she wanted to talk about was her relationship with God.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's everyone's quest is to ask, like you were saying about lesson 182, to ask ourselves, well, what happened? How did I get here? You know, what's the meaning of all this crazy stuff that I consider to be reality? And the course suggests, well, we've given it all the meaning that we think it has, and we can stop giving it that meaning by choosing the thought system of pure non-duality, which is equivalent to continuously, and you know, or building up to continuously questioning the thought system of duality and seeing that, you know, that the separation didn't happen ultimately by proving to ourselves that it had no effect on our real nature. And we do that by seeing the innocence in everyone and everything in our mind, and that the projections that seem to be representatives of duality are just erroneous thinking. They're just correctable thoughts that if we question their foundation, which is questioning the thought system that made them up, eventually they will disappear because they're house of cards, you know, made out of a whole lot of nothing, including the what we think of as a material universe. I've been watching videos this morning on the James Webb Space Telescope and how it's just kind of rocking the foundations of the whole Big Bang theory. And there was excellent 60 Minutes documentary on it, and some other YouTube videos by Michio Kaku and other physicists who basically are, you know, saying, well, maybe we got it wrong. Maybe this whole Big Bang theory isn't working. And that's just on the level of form. But, you know, really more fundamentally, it's like, well, what if we got the whole premise for materiality wrong? You know, the whole
Which is,
premise.
I mean,
Yeah.
a scientist is going to ask that question. That's the reason of science, not to say we found the answer now, let's stop looking. But we found an answer, but there's, because we don't get the full answer, we're going to continue to look for more. A
Right.
good
Right.
scientist is going to say that. That's why when people say, well, you know, I'm a scientist, so I don't believe in God. Like, well, what kind of scientist is that? That doesn't even question to as far as you can go with, you know, could there be a God, and, you know, does God exist? You know, you just give up by saying, I don't believe it, or I don't agree, or I think it's fiction. But in reality, because you didn't actually ask the question and research it, you're just assuming something that you have no information about. And the thing that's so crazy is they would give you an F on your paper if you, if you said, does gravity exist? I don't find any thing that would say that there's a force here, so I can't measure the force, I don't know the force, so yeah, it doesn't exist. When in reality, you can and do, because we researched it.
Yeah.
We don't know
It
what it is.
it
Or
all boils down to fundamental assumptions, and the assumptions that most everyone in this world thinks are fundamental are not fundamental at all. They're really based on other assumptions about the nature of reality um, well, we assume that the sensory data that we process, interpret, distort, and otherwise obfuscate is it has some legitimacy, behind all that crazy distortion, limitations, and obfuscations and denials. There's something we assume that there must be something there, an objective reality, quote, out there, unquote, and yet science really, since the quantum revolution, suggests, well, what if that isn't really the whole story? What if mind can no longer be swept under the rug and conveniently dismissed? Well, that changes everything. What if what if the tiny mad idea, aka Big Bang, and its reflection and form, um, is all made up? What if what if we got this whole thing wrong? And could we be happy to be wrong? I mean, there's a scientific question that it isn't frequently asked, and
yeah,
another thing that it was probably the last thing that science will ever ask is, what could the universe have been made from unconscious guilt over a separation that didn't happen?
yeah, and you and I assume that yes, it was because A Course in Miracles, Jesus says it, and I've seen it happen. I mean, I see how my belief in guilt has made everything in this world what it is.
Mhm, mhm.
It's not, it's not like, I physically built a house, but all the thoughts that I have about the house, everything I know about the house, everything I assume about the house, all of those things are really based on fear. Um, Even the joy of having a house. Now I have to pay for the, payment. I have to pay the insurance. I have to keep it up. I have to. There's no real joy that comes from anything in this world,
Mhm.
um, because we're looking for love in all the wrong places.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, in today's workbook lesson, one of my favorite parts of that is, and I've been applying pretty much every day the last few months as I'm preparing to move from one house to another house and call it home. 1,000 homes he builds, and yet none contents his restless mind. And then the restless mind phrase I noticed when I was rereading 182 this morning is repeated elsewhere in that lesson. It's like, well, that's the restless mind is because we made the wrong assumptions. We assumed that the identity that we made up is legitimate, and that there's other separate identities and they're legitimate, as in and of themselves, with sovereign, unique, different natures and qualities and identities. And what if we made that all up? It's
Yeah.
we have to we have to if we want eternal peace, lasting peace, sustainable peace. We have to be willing to look at what would a sustainable foundation be, and anything that changes, um, seems reasonable to question that as a foundational assumption for something that couldn't possibly change, which to me seems like the noblest definition of truth would be, what doesn't change.
Yeah,
Mm,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, and it's so crazy because when we come into this world, that lesson talks a lot about the little child. We come into this world perfect. We know nothing, and everything that we're told is a lie from the very beginning. You're a girl, you're a boy, your name is Lynn, your name is Bruce, you are a human, you are, this, you are that. And, we're told we don't come in and become what we are. We come in and we're told what we are by everything around us. And that's why we don't experience our home. We don't experience anything that's real because it's nothing that's real. Everything everything we're given is a lie.
Mhm. and all the ones that are doing the telling to us as infants and children and adolescents and onward, they're all they're all hired actors in our theatrical production company in our mind that merely are, doing their assigned roles and playing their parts and staying in character, delivering the message that we, instructed them to deliver and paid them handsomely to deliver.
Yes, giving us exactly what we asked for on every and it's just so crazy. Yeah, it's the world is what I want it to be whenever I decide. And so, I can, come and say, the world is friendly. The world is a friendly place, and people are loving and kindness is everywhere. And then when I look, what am I going to find? Kindness, love, peace, helpers, people doing wonderful things.
Mm-hmm.
I can sit, and like when I first get up, sometimes I'll go and look at, some videos or something, and there's always some things about wonderful things people have done, and people, how people have helped other people. And they're sitting right next to other things about how evil things are and how bad things are and how harmful things are. But I'm looking for the good. I'm looking for the beauty here, not I'm not calling for more war. I'm calling for peace and love. And
Mm-hmm.
so, that's really, and you do get what you ask for. So, if I want to see upset, I will see it. It will be presented to me in many ways, from my body to my family to the world to the weather to I can find uh, upset anywhere, but I can also see peace instead of this. And that's all we're asked to do. So and why not? It makes you so much happier. I'm a much happier person when I'm looking for love than I am when I'm looking for uh anger, fear, frustration, guilt. I mean, you can find it anywhere, but
Mm-hmm.
anyway,
And
let's
the seek and find and seek and do not find principles are kind of the two cornerstones of Holy Spirit and ego's thought systems. As long as we want to stay frustrated and feel discombobulated and disconnected and different and isolated, or as the Course puts it, uncertain, lonely, and in constant fear, then Holy Spirit's our game. And when we stop wanting to play that game, it's like, oh, well, then in order to resign from the game, there's a procedure that uh, we need to complete, and that's the Course's forgiveness classroom, right? So,
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And basically it's putting all the toys back in the box. Just
Right.
saying,
And then the toys uh, all disappear as we're putting them in the box, and then when we put the last one in, the box disappears too.
that's right. That's right. I love
Because
it.
we made it all up.
Made it all up. And
It's
that
just a
reminds me of
dream.
Pandora, because that's all Pandora. I mean, that's how I see the tiny man idea. Was, we found a box and said, let's see what's in there.
Mhm.
And we let loose everything awful, but we can put it all back because the last thing that came out of the box was hope. I love that story. Uh, anyhow, uh, let's
Yep.
continue reading.
Okay.
Uh, okay, so he was just writing about Helen's early interest in religion and the paper that she wrote for school about, was it for school, that paper? Anyway, I think it was. So about her religious search, and this was long before
Mhm.
Course in Miracles. So Ken says, this book, on the other hand, is written from the opposite point of view, religious rather than psychological, a view to which, of course, Helen herself later subscribed. Part one thus draws largely from Helen's graduate school paper, which served as the basis for the aforementioned autobiography, and which actually exists in 8.5, almost mostly similar versions. The first being the paper handed in at New York University. 4.5 more are Helen's initial edits of the paper for the autobiography. And in parentheses says, The second part was edited by her twice, hence the half. Helen's and my later combined editing, Helen's retyping of our editing, which contains still other changes. And this is kind of how the course went too. He says Helen was a compulsive editor. Finally, there was another graduate school paper dealing with her early years, totally different from the others in the absence of any religious emphasis, though still containing some religious material. In my quotations here, I have chosen the form that was most consistently used by Helen, as well as by the material I know, based upon my discussions with Helen over the years, to be closest to her own experience. So there, she wrote several drafts or versions of her autobiography, but really none of them were completely honest, I think is what he's saying, or that they're the last one was more more true.
And to make this personal story more transpersonal or universally applicable per se, it would be, in order for us to be completely honest, we have to notice how we keep trying to rewrite our identity as being something separate from our real identity and separate from each other, and notice the dishonesty, and forgive ourselves for that, because it has had no effect on our real identity.
Exactly. I mean, the whole point is that, all this dream world that we're living in, all these stories we have of our life, the day I was born, this is what happened, all these stories, they're all unedited drafts. And what came to me as I was reading that is we spend so much of our life trying to edit our life story, trying to say, well, this is what happened when Uncle Joe said this, or this is what happened when, we have all different stories of how and when things happened. And so, and even in families, I noticed that in my own family, none of us can agree on what the real story was, because we all have our own. But in your life, you always going back, or me, I don't say you, I don't know you. Me though, I'm always going back to conversations that I had and trying to make them better, going back to things that I did and trying to justify or not feel guilty about it. I'm always trying to edit the past and, what to polish it up so that it, is acceptable, that somehow I can feel innocent, which is really point of all this. We're all just trying to find our own innocence. So, Helen's stories, because she did start with her story of God, and that was honest. That's the most honest thing I think she could have done. And then, after, by the end of it, she was able to mask that and just make it more secular, apparently, or less, more of a story that didn't include God as its focus.
Yeah, as you're sharing that, the word revision kind of stuck with me, and I was thinking about the tool of the trade that I use for doing online web work is WordPress, and it's a web publishing system that open source system that works online, and it's set up so that you can set the number of revisions of different posts that you've made, and so you can undo what you did, and go back like 5 revisions or 17 revisions or whatever. And I'm saying, well, the Holy Spirit's thought system is incredibly patient and persistent, and will help us to go all the way back to prior to the first revision of our identity, and essentially undo all the little pieces we tried to carve out of unity, and put every little piece back in place, back into unity, because it never left, because we made up the idea that we could carve a separate identity out of perfect oneness. And so it has an infinite undo capability, for people that have used software that has an undo function in certain places, which is always handy if you've done something and realize, oh no, that's completely wrong, or I need to change that altogether, you just hit undo, right? Well,
Yeah.
the course's undo is forgiveness, and when we forgive, we recognize that what we think our brother has done to us has not occurred, as the everyday hit the ground running, practical, hands-on method of just noticing all the things that we've projected out into the world are really coming from our own mind, and the guilt that we had associated with the alleged others is equally invalid and forgivable as the guilt that we associate with ourselves for having made that up and projected that out onto the world and people in it in the first place, right? So that's why if we're really persistent and patient and gentle with ourselves, we can keep practicing that forgiveness process to the point where we generalize it, and it just becomes an automatic thing to say, oh, if there's something that's upsetting me, that is coming from me, and it's forgivable because it hasn't changed my real identity or anyone else's, and we're all completely innocent, and we're already home, as lesson 182, today's workbook lesson, we're doing it chronologically, would keep reminding us.
Exactly. Absolutely. Thank you. Yes. Undo, 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 undo. First
Yeah.
place I saw that was on an IBM Selectric, and I was like,
Cool, no more liquid paper.
and it did undo because it had a reel of what do you call it? Liquid paper, basically.
Right,
And
yeah,
it would just go back and white out
exactly.
everything. Just white it
Which
out.
is interesting because, when word processing came along, it really introduced us to the idea that, until we commit it to paper, the idea exists as ones and zeros and in a little digital form that's really representative of the mental form. And it's only when we say, I want this to be, expressed in form, that we then seem to have something that's, unchangeable, unless you, throw more atoms on top of it, and that liquid paper metaphor. But even that really is just a reflection of an idea. And the idea can be undone at any time, even though on the level of form, it seems to be more complicated a lot of times.
Seems like you have a lot to do, yeah, but it's
Yeah, the remodeling process, which it's fresh in my mind because we just had a skylight replaced that was leaking yesterday, and before we moved to another state, and it was like, oh yeah, that was an idea that I was thinking about the wonderful song from the Sgt. Pepper's album the Beatles did, "Fixing a Hole Where the Rain Gets In and Keeps My
uh-huh.
Mind from Wandering Where It Will Go."
Yep,
And
the
doesn't
integrity.
really matter if I'm wrong, I'm right. Where I belong, I'm right. Right? Yeah.
You must listen to a lot of Beatles.
I like the Beatles. What can I
Yeah,
say?
I do too. All right, you want to
But
read on?
I think we have one more paragraph in that. You want to finish that, and then I'll start on chapter
Okay,
one.
I'll read the last paragraph. Okay.
Okay.
Finally, I may note that Helen's experiences, but she relegated to the psychological in writing about them, clearly do not fall under any psychiatric classification. And he's mentioning the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, has no category for authentic spiritual experience, let alone scribing. Yep. There's nothing in the DSM about that. I think they call it schizophrenia. But rather, her reactions to this inner voice of Jesus reflected a lifetime's conflict between two parts of her personality, heaven or Helen, God or the ego. In other words, for Helen, the basic question was, am I a child of God or a child of the ego? Her entire personal life reflected a vacillation between these two poles, and we begin our story with an account of this conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's a footnote, which this is different on Kindle. We usually don't get the footnotes. You have to go to the back of the book, so this is nice. The footnote says the word ego is used in the course to denote the false self that was made in opposition to and as a substitute for the self of Christ that God created and which is our true spiritual identity.
Yep. Yeah, I was amused with his introduction title, well, it's actually the title for the next chapter, Heaven and Helen. Helen being, wordplay on hell. And I was thinking, well, gee, that's something that Helen and I share is we both have really, really handy first names for reminding us of metaphysical principles. Because I when I was in a conference of the scribes that Kathy Scott Perry put together, I guess 8, 9, 10 years ago, maybe 11 years ago.
Yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. Anyway, I had this little sudden impish grin as I thought, well, gee, I could just write Bruce there, but then I thought that's all made up. So I added a colon, and underneath that I put a fiction. So sometimes in course circles I refer to myself as Bruce of fiction. So if Helen wanted to refer to herself as hell, and she and I both have a good reminders of what we've made of our little s selves, right?
That's pretty funny. That's cute. I
Yep.
love it. All right.
Shall I read chapter 1? Start into it? Okay. So, Heaven and Helen, introduction. This is on page 19 for people who might be reading along in the print version. I know Lynn's on the Kindle version. Okay, so Ken begins, far beyond all the material and psychological circumstances of Helen's life, there can be found an underlying tension that runs throughout, almost from birth, and in its intensity assumes quasi-cosmic proportions. It was a conflict between two mutually exclusive identities, and a conflict which appeared never to be truly resolved, certainly not in the perception of this world. The dynamics of this basic conflict are central to an understanding of Helen's life, both prior to, during, and following her scribing of A Course in Miracles. Very shortly after Jesus began dictating the course to Helen, he gave her what was called a, quote, special revelation, unquote, which actually reflects Helen's spiritual self, with a capital S, that I referred to in the preface. He said to her, and this is Ken quoting, "You are holy, WHOLLY, lovely, a perfect shaft of pure light. Before your loveliness, the stars stand transfixed and bow to the power of your will. What do children know of their creation except what their creator tells them? You were created above the angels because your role involves creation as well as protection. You who are the image of the Father need bow only to him, before whom I kneel with you." And this is in brackets, a reference to an experience Helen had prior to the course's scribing. See below page 106. So I wonder if that's her subway experience. I think that might be what he's referring to. Maybe not, but anyway. Helen had a mystical experience on the New York subway system that Ken describes in various places. Any comments on that so far?
I think that's pretty amazing that I think if I got a message that said you are holy, lovely, a perfect shaft of pure light, before your loveliness of the stars stand transfixed and bow to the power of your will, I would say, am I schizophrenic? I don't believe this. I'm sure Helen didn't believe it either. But this really says so much. What do children know of their creation except what their creator tells them? Mm-hmm. You were created above the angels because your role involves creation as well as protection. And I mean, here's a hint of the course saying that we are co-creators with God. How would she have understood this at all? But she still wrote it down and she still shared it. Mm-hmm. Which is really, just again, it just highlights that conflict that she had between her conceptual life and her spiritual life. Anyway, interesting. Anyway, continue on.
Yeah, it really is interesting.
Chapter 5 is where that is. It's going to be in chapter 5, which I think your book says a page number.
Oh, right. Yes, got it. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. Yeah. I just think it's interesting that you know throughout this book, Ken is, and I didn't really notice it as much the first time reading this some years ago, is really basically describing again Helen's life as just an example of how one particular life reflects the general condition that we're all facing, and that is our tremendous ambivalence and resistance to what we know to be true, um, because we still doggedly pursue, a, a curriculum that doesn't work, which is egos following the ego's propaganda, and not questioning it. And um, you know, Jesus is, with Ken's help, pointing out that we're all facing the same problem, and we just need to keep looking at uh, you know what alternative there might be to what doesn't work. And yeah,
Yeah.
shall I read on? You
Yeah.
want to read some?
Why don't you continue?
Okay. And yet Helen's own view of herself was quite different. Did I already read that? I don't think so.
No, you didn't.
Okay. And yet Helen's own view of herself was quite different, and she felt most uncomfortable with Jesus' estimation of herself and could not accept it. In a vision that preceded the actual scribing of the course, and which we shall quote in its entirety in chapter 5, Helen saw herself kneeling before a very holy priestess, also a symbol of the true innocence of her capital S self. For quite a while, Helen was unable to look at the priestess's face. In fear of the condemnation she was sure she would see there. Finally, she looked directly at the priestess. When I did, I burst into tears. Her face was gentle and full of compassion, and her eyes were beyond description. She knew nothing about me that warranted condemnation. I loved her so much that I literally fell on my knees in front of her. Wow. I think that really is a symbolic description of when we really look at our true nature with Holy Spirit's help, how could we feel anything but tremendous compassion for ourselves and complete absolution of the guilt that we foisted on ourselves, and then an attempt to eradicate it foist on everyone else needlessly.
Yeah. And, it just is so beautiful to read this and to, um, I mean, to have a feeling and experience of such love,
Mhm.
and it's like it was like a vision or something that you know it just brought about this complete letting go of the wall that's blocking. And I think that's really part of the reason. Not I don't say Jesus chose Helen. He didn't, because she agreed to it long before this lifetime ever was. um but that she was uh open and willing to see this other person, this other way of seeing herself. And I also see in this, and we'll read as we read her life story, the longing for that love connection, that she longed for her mother. She longed for um, a contact and connection with other people in a loving way. And so for her to experience this in this vision or this dream, um, to see that she was not condemned, but she was really loved, is kind of a fulfillment of a deep desire that she had to to be unconditionally loved. It's just so beautiful.
Yeah, and that's our the longing that we all have. That's the little child asking for, that's to be still a moment and go home. That's the part of us that wants to truly know what doesn't change, and realize that we've never lost our identity or identification with that, except in a fearful dream that we can wake up from.
Yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful.
yeah.
Yes. You want me
Do you
to
want to read
start?
on? And now we're at the
I'll
top
read.
of page 20. I peeked ahead and even though I've read this some years ago, but I've forgotten how little he gives to another 24 pages he devotes to Helen's life before the scribing of the course, and then the vast majority of the rest of the book begins with the scribing of the course. So we've got another 24 pages of Helen's life before the course, right?
Cool. Cool. Well,
Yeah.
and it's so relevant because, you can look at your own life and see how similar and parallel,
Mm-hmm.
really. So, reading on. The opening lines of lesson 93, which we all love, lesson 93, light and peace and joy abide in me. And the opening lines are, you think you're the worst thing that ever happened. And if you could ever look at yourself for real, you'd kill yourself. So he's probably going to quote that,
Well
but
paraphrased. He's going to recite that in the next page, but
okay, I'll,
yeah.
I'll continue on then. The opening lines of lesson 93 in the workbook serve as a powerful summarizing statement of Helen's negative self-concept, a concept on one level all of us share. It was one which she successfully hid from the world, but not as successfully from herself. And yeah, here it is, the first paragraph of lesson 93, light and peace and joy abide in me. You think you are the home of evil, darkness, and sin. You think if anyone could see the truth about you, he would be repelled, recoiling from you as if from a poisonous snake. You think if what is true about you were revealed to you, you would be struck with horror so intense that you would rush to death by your own hands. And that's workbook lesson 93, paragraph 1. This
Mm-hmm.
conflict was powerfully experienced by Helen in successive events that occurred in southern France and London during a period when A Course in Miracles was still coming through. And so this is another experience. Before falling asleep in France one evening, a sense of unbelievable strength and joy rose up in me, beginning in the chest area and rising up into my throat and out into my arms. For several minutes, I felt as if I could easily reach out and touch the whole world and everyone in it. My sense of closeness to them all was intensely joyous. Wow, this is beautiful, and this is when the course was coming through. Later in London, this happy experience had a fearful counterpart in the form of a startlingly clear sensation of horror. One evening, I lay down for a brief rest before getting ready for dinner. Most unexpectedly, I was seized by a murderous rage, so intense and so completely indiscriminate that I jumped up, literally shaking. An ugly, hateful thing seemed to rise up in me and take over my body. These two experiences presented such a shocking contrast that they almost seemed to represent heaven and hell. Wow, yeah.
So now here's a good example of level of confusion. If we read this on the literal level, we would say, "Gosh, well, maybe I should, you know, stop speaking English and take up French," because that's where Helen had this more beatific experience instead of this nightmarish one.
Yep, and London was full of terror. And I think the feeling, I mean, a lot of folks do work in the chakras and the Kundalini and the rising of the Kundalini. Both of these experiences kind of express that same kind of feeling that you have, that something rose up from within you and you know filled you with a feeling, filled you with an experience. And I mean, she doesn't say that there was any reason for this rage, just as there was no reason for the joy. And she doesn't say what happened to her afterwards. Maybe she will, but um, it's just interesting that she had both of those while on a European trip. I'll
Mhm.
continue with Ken.
And sometimes that contrast is really helpful. And I think the course uses the juxtaposition of the extreme difference in the level of the mind of the two thought systems, and the stark contrast is really, I think, what ultimately when we get back to our mind and stop paying quite so much attention to the ego's propaganda that says, well, no, there's really some good and evil and some evil and good, and you can't really tell them apart, and evil isn't even the right word. It's really oneness and duality is probably a better description. It's like the course's pure non-dual metaphysics is really the only place where peace is possible, and fortunately, that's our real identity, and we can't completely disconnect or divorce ourselves from that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We're actually borrowing we're borrowing from our real identity to make this experience by distorting it and imposing upon it ideas that are completely antithetical to what we really are. But that seems to be, what our experience is, until we recognize that, well, what if I'm twisting and distorting and subverting and perverting and inverting everything and just making a mess of reality. And I don't have to do that, needless suffering.
Yeah. I mean, the whole point of the duality is the idea of conflict, and the idea of opposites and differences, and the whole thing that happens when you forgive, you're forgiving the differences, you're forgiving the things that are making things not the same, and you're only maintaining or retaining the sameness. So, when I forgive, that the things that I think upset me, or the things that I think make me afraid or feel guilty, when I can forgive those things, then, I don't have conflict anymore. I mean, it's just simple. So, this is where we're moving to. So, I'm going to continue reading.
Okay.
Helen described this latter experience to me as her feeling almost possessed by a hatred so intense she believed at that moment she could have gladly destroyed the entire world, the exact counterpart of the former experience, when the love, equally intense in its scope, surged through her and embraced the world. Helen also experienced a similar contrast in the period immediately preceding the beginning of the course. There, the contrast was between a, quote, good and, quote, evil priestess. We shall return to this in a later chapter. I like the way how Ken kind of eggs you on to keep reading. Oh, I like to read. Sorry. He was a good newspaper man. He was.
Yep.
What are you going to say?
Continued on page 17 or whatever.
Okay.
Although we're on page 21 now.
On rare occasions, Helen expressed to me the painful reality that she did not know how to love. And boy, do I know that. She knew that her love for me, for example, as we shall discuss in part 3, was greatly distorted by her own needs to control her fear of loss and abandonment, as well as to defend against her underlying hatred for everyone and everything she was dependent on. Holy cow. I mean, think about this. If you recognize that the love that you feel for, anyone is greatly distorted by your own needs to control your fear of loss and abandonment, your own needs to defend against, your anger and hatred for everyone and everything that you think you are dependent on. I mean, that's kind of the way of the world.
Yeah. As you're reading that, I was thinking we're on the same wavelength, because I remember when I first read this, I probably spent most of the time while reading it thinking about, wow, what an interesting story about Helen. Now I'm reading it's like, wow, what an interesting story about my two thought systems, which is the same as everyone else's two thought systems. And we could reread this paragraph as, on rare occasions, I have expressed to myself in moments of honesty the painful reality that I do not know how to love. I knew that my love for Jesus or everyone else or a creator is greatly distorted by my need to control my fear of loss and abandonment, as well as to defend against my underlying hatred for everyone and everything I am dependent on. Well, everyone can say that if they're honest with themselves and looking at the insanity of everyone's ego, right? So
Yeah.
sensitive to this dynamic in others and the tragic personal consequence of this albatross. The ego hangs around my neck. I also know that I could not let go of these same needs in myself, right? So
Yeah.
there it is.
Yeah.
And if we can just remember that I'm projecting all the time while I'm dreaming, which is 24/7, as long as I think there's a material world and I think I'm a separate self in it. Yep. Sure enough, that checklist is complete. I'm still projecting.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So yeah, that's why I love, I'm glad we're reading this book because
Oh,
I
me
mean,
too. Me too. Yeah.
it's the same thing. And I'm astonished,
Mm-hmm.
I'm astonished. And that she, I mean, there's some people right now, in the course community, of the course world, that think not very highly of Helen and think not very highly of her personality and the things that she did with editing and all that kind of stuff, because they honestly believe that somehow or the other they could have done it better. There was, a better way of doing it. But and they will go back and say, well, Helen was a what do you call her, something editor, that she was, she did this and she did that and she
Compulsive, I
did
think.
this and she that, compulsive editor.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that doesn't matter because the book is the one that Jesus agreed was the one to publish.
And
So
and
Jesus,
also, oh, go ahead.
go ahead.
I was just going to say, and if we're back to the okay, let's forget the level of confusion and get back to what this book is really about, and not just A Course in Miracles, but this autobiography, which I'm sure was Ken's intent when he was penning it. It was like, if everyone who reads this realizes this is my story, not just Helen's, then it's my compulsive editing of my identity that I think I have a personality and am a personality that's different and separate from everyone else's. It's like, well, there's the rub, there's the problem right there. And so, Helen's personality is no better or worse than any other personality. They're equally unreal and in truth. And if I can just remember that and remember to gently, not and persistently and but most importantly, non-derisively see that that is just a silly, ineffectual strategy to keep myself away from peace. And then ask myself, why in the world would I want to do that? Well, it's because I think what I made up is real and I want to defend it to the death, which of course is made up too.
Yeah. I mean, it all makes sense.
It makes sense to everyone in the asylum.
And
All
it's
8 billion of us. Okay.
so beautiful that, let's see, I think we don't have time to really read anymore um,
Oh yeah.
today.
Shall we
This,
just finish that last paragraph real quick?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. I'll wrap it up here. The persistent conflict of who she ran through Helen's entire life, as does who she was. Okay, thank you. That didn't sound right. Okay, sorry. The persistent conflict of who she was ran through Helen's entire life, as does a theme in a symphony. In undergraduate school, Helen wrote a composition, probably an exercise in creative writing, that dealt with a fish who wished to be a bird and then, on being able to fly, wished he were a fish again, yet throughout retaining a fundamental dissatisfaction with his lot in life. Though written with a more than slight tongue-in-cheek, beginning with its title, which was borrowed from Shakespeare's second sonnet, the short story reflects Helen's inability to make up her mind about who she was. It begins and ends with a cute note to her professor. So we can reread that again next week. But we're all making stuff up about who we are 24/7, and therein lies our both the recognition of that lies, and in that lies our happiness, right? So.
Exactly. And uh, that's that's what we're here for. is to learn the difference. So thank you so much, Bruce Rawles. This has been a lot of fun. And
Likewise.
I'm going to, okay, I'm going
Have a great
to,
week, and as long as you can find me and